Hello everyone, welcome to Live Interactive English. I'm Mike, and it is day 2 of our look at quarantine. Yeah, the whole word, the history of it, why people do this type of thing. And, you know, it would be kind of a strange article to be having, quarantine. Okay, let's talk about that. But of course, in the last year or two, this is a word that everyone has become very familiar with. Maybe even some of you have had to do your own quarantine. Maybe you were unlucky enough to get sick with COVID-19, or maybe you were traveling and you were caught going into or out of a country and forced to do a quarantine. I had a few friends who had to do the 2 weeks in a hotel here in Taiwan, and it didn't sound like a lot of fun, and that's one of the main reasons that I haven't been traveling recently, because quarantine does often mean spending a lot of time on your own, away from other people, but for a good reason, to keep yourself and everyone around you healthier and safer. So quarantine may not be fun, but it's important, and the last 2 years have shown us exactly why. So let's look at a brief history of quarantine, part 2, and get into today's article. Throughout history, quarantine has been reintroduced again and again to prevent the spread of diseases. In 1793, the U.S. city of Philadelphia tried to put the brakes on yellow fever by quarantining sailors outside the city. Perhaps the most famous quarantine case involved an Irish-born cook. In the early 20th century, Mary Mallon carried a type of bacteria that caused typhoid fever. Though Mallon never got sick from the disease herself, officials traced dozens of cases of typhoid fever back to her. They placed her in quarantine and made her promise never to cook for others again. But Typhoid Mary broke her promise and was forced into quarantine again, this time for the rest of her life. All right, quarantine, a brief history, part 2. Let's get into our article, and it is actually talking about history. It begins throughout history. So if we look back through all of history, throughout history, quarantine has been reintroduced again and again to prevent the spread of diseases. So this idea is basically every time a new disease comes along in a different part of the world, they have to bring in or reintroduce quarantine to help fight the spread of the disease, because quarantine, although it's not as wonderful as taking a magic pill or getting a shot, it does help to stop the spread or prevent the spread of diseases. That's why they've used it again and again through history. Here's one example of many, but still going back quite a long time. It says in 1793, that's right, just a few years after America even was a country, in 1793, the U.S. city of Philadelphia tried to put the brakes on yellow fever by quarantining sailors outside the city. So there in Philadelphia back in 1793, it wasn't COVID-19, it was yellow fever, which is actually even more dangerous and deadly and terrible than COVID-19. It's kind of like malaria. You get it from being bitten by mosquitoes, and it can spread very easily, and it can kill lots of people. So they tried to put the brakes on the spread of this disease by quarantining sailors, the ones who are probably coming from warmer parts of the world with the yellow fever in their bodies, and then it would spread during the hot summer months in Philadelphia. When we talk about putting the brakes on something, we're basically saying slowing something down, hopefully maybe even stopping something. But here we're actually using kind of an interesting comparison. We're comparing stopping a disease to stopping a car, because that's actually what brakes are. There are those things that you press on in a car or you squeeze on a bicycle that slow down the wheel and slow down the actual machine, the actual speed of the thing that you're riding on. In a car, you press on the brakes. On a motorcycle or a bicycle, you squeeze them with your hands, left and right brake. But basically, they squeeze on the wheel, they slow the wheel down, and then they slow the car down. So for example, we could say the brakes on this car make a lot of noise. There's like a weird loud screeching noise. I think you should take your brakes or take your car to the garage and have someone look at it. But of course, when we use it in this way, we're basically saying slow something down, put the brakes on that plan, slow down that plan, but we're comparing it to slowing down a car or a bicycle. Here, the yellow fever was being brought to Philadelphia by sailors. They were the ones quarantined. What are sailors? They're basically people who work on a boat or a ship. All right, that's about all it is. There'll be the captain, who's like the boss of the boat, and the sailors, who are the workers on the boat. In the Navy, the sailors will be maybe fighting men, but they'll also be working and making the engine work or fixing things in the boat. Basically, they just work in the boat, making sure it works properly and no problems come up. For example, we could say the sailors were happy to be back on land, on dry land. The sailors were happy to be back on dry land. They work on the boat, they're out at sea. When they can come to a city and go back and walk around on dry land, get a good meal in a restaurant, they're very happy. All right, let's get to another quarantine story from history. So first we started in Philadelphia. Now we're moving on. It says perhaps the most famous quarantine case involved an Irish-born cook. In the early 20th century, Mary Mallon carried a type of bacteria that caused typhoid fever, another very dangerous disease. Something you can catch in all sorts of different places, but basically it's something that can kill a lot of people too. This one is spread by a bacteria. A bacteria is basically a very tiny, tiny, tiny living thing. You'd have to see it with a microscope or something like that. But we often think of bacteria as also being those dirty things that make us sick. You can get sick from viruses or sick from bacteria. Now, some bacteria actually are good for you, right? We have bacteria in our stomach that help us to digest our food, but other bacteria can be bad for you. If you get a cut, you should wash the cut, because if you get bacteria in that, you can get an infection and get sick. So many types of bacteria can make us sick. It says, for example, heat is effective at killing many kinds of bacteria, right? That's why we cook our food. You don't just go and eat meat like a lion would or like a dog would. No, we cook our food. One of the things that we do when we cook food is kill any bacteria in there. So Mary Mallon was carrying this bacteria. She was spreading typhoid to people around her. It says, though Mallon never got sick from the disease herself, she never actually got typhoid. Officials traced dozens of cases of typhoid fever back to her. She worked in all these different places, and she was spreading typhoid to these different places, and of course then those people were getting sick. So they traced it, they kind of followed it back to her. In the same way that the government here, right, was saying, oh, this person caught COVID from that person, and then they met that person, so they can kind of follow it back to where it started. So what did they do once they found Mary Mallon? They placed her in quarantine and made her promise never to cook for others again. So she was in trouble. She had to go to quarantine. Don't do that job. You're making people sick. That's what they told her. But Typhoid Mary broke her promise and was forced into quarantine again, this time for the rest of her life. Wow, so she broke the rules, got out of quarantine, made more people sick. They caught her again. That is a really long quarantine. But I guess if that's what it takes to keep people healthy and safe, that's what they had to do back then. Anyway, they traced it. As I mentioned, trace is to kind of follow something. If you see footprints leading away from a crime, the police will trace that. Or if someone calls you, the police might be able to find out who's calling you and where from. They'll trace the call back to where it started from. So follow it back to where it begins. For example, the cause of the fire was traced to the kitchen. The whole building was on fire, but the scientists and police officers or firemen, they kind of followed it and said, oh, it started in the kitchen and then spread to other parts of the building. And when you promise, you basically say, this is true, please believe me. You're trying to, make sure that people know that what you're saying is true. It's like a guarantee. I'm not lying. I promise you. I want you to listen to these important words. I mean it, and I want you to trust me and believe me. We can use it as a verb, to promise, and those words that you say, those important words that you say, that is your promise, all right? For example, Monty promised to buy his daughter a new soccer ball. Well, I hope he does, because you don't want to break your promise. All right, it's time for our break.
Hello， 大家好，我是 Hanny。我们继续来看隔离的历史。前一天课文写到1348年威尼斯贸易港建立的检疫系统，那现在把时间拉到1793年。费城 Philadelphia 这个美国城市呢，试图把船员隔离在这个城外，来抑制黄热病。然后在20世纪初左右，有一位名叫 Mary Mallon 的厨师，他带有一种会引起伤寒的病菌。虽然他本人从来没有因为这种疾病而生病，可是官员们在追溯伤寒病例的时候，都有回追到他的身上，有几十个案例都是从他身上来的。于是官员们就把他隔离，然后要他承诺再也不替别人做饭。但是他违背了承诺，可能太爱煮饭了吧。那后来就被迫再度隔离，这一次呢是终身隔离。我们来看5个单字。Brake, B-R-A-K-E 这个 brake 当名词，它表示刹车，它也有约束、抑制因素的意思。那么 put the brakes on something 字面意思是对什么踩刹车，引申的意思就是表达抑制、制止的意思。好，当刹车有问题的时候呢，可能会发出那种刺耳的声音。Mike 老师用到 screech。S-C-R-E-E-C-H， 我再拼一次哦 ，S-C-R-E-E-C-H，screech 可以表达尖叫或者是发出刺耳的声音。再来看到 sailor 是船员或者是水手 ，bacteria 它是细菌。注意这个名词它是复数，它的单数是 bacterium。再来看 trace 这个动词，它有追溯或是查出的意思。还有 promise， 它可以当动词来表达承诺、保证，也可以当名词来指承诺、诺言。好，我们再补充一下文中提到的疾病 ，yellow fever 是黄热病，那么 typhoid fever 则是指伤寒热。接回到课文中。
In 2003, Toronto, Canada became the center of the SARS epidemic. The city took widespread measures to control the spread of the disease. In total, 25,000 people ended up in quarantine. Some have questioned the effectiveness of quarantine, while others fear its damage to the economy. Still, as history has shown, quarantine saves lives and remains important for disease prevention. Okay, so we started in Philadelphia in 1793, and then we moved on to, I think, New York. That was where Mary Mallon, or Typhoid Mary, as she's known to history. Now we go to somewhere much, well, far away, but much closer in time. It says in 2003, so not long ago, Toronto, Canada became the center of the SARS epidemic. Yeah, remember SARS? It affected Taiwan in a fairly small way. Only a few people died here, luckily, but Toronto, Canada had a much bigger problem with SARS back in 2003. It says the city took widespread measures to control the spread of the disease. So kind of like some certain places did with COVID-19. More recently, Toronto did something similar with SARS back in 2003. How many people were put into quarantine? It says in total, 25,000 people ended up in quarantine. So it was a very serious problem. I remember SARS was harder to catch than COVID-19, but if you did catch it, it had a much bigger chance of killing people. So in some ways it was a bit scarier because you really didn't want to get SARS. It was a bad situation, so they had to put 25,000 people in quarantine. And remember, this hadn't been done in a long time, so it was quite a shock to people to be told to stay home, don't go out, don't see anyone, always wear a mask. This was all quite new back in 2003. Now, of course, we're kind of used to it. Now, back then it says, some have questioned the effectiveness of quarantine, while others fear its damage to the economy. We're still having the same questions these days, right? Is staying home really going to protect you from COVID? And what about the economy? What about all those people who lose jobs and the businesses that lose money and stuff like that? Is avoiding a sickness really worth all of that other trouble? It's a difficult question. Still, as history has shown, quarantine saves lives and remains important for disease prevention. Well, absolutely. The economy is important, jobs and money are important, but people's lives are always more important. And quarantine, even though, as I said, it's not as good as a wonderful medicine or something like that, it does save lives, and it is still important for disease prevention, at least until those wonderful medicines get a chance to catch up, and we do have them to keep us safe. Until then, quarantine is very useful. So here's our what do you think question. What were you most surprised to discover about quarantine? Well, I'd have to say I was surprised to find out that Philadelphia had a yellow fever problem back in 1793. I always thought of yellow fever as something you might get in Africa or South America, or in the warmer parts of the world. I never imagined that Philadelphia had a yellow fever problem way back then. So there you go. Diseases are out there. Often we don't even notice them. They don't bother us. But when they do, quarantine can often be the answer to many of our problems and help us to avoid many bad situations and dangerous diseases. Thanks for joining us, guys. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you back here very, very soon. Until then, bye-bye.
在2003年，加拿大多伦多成为 SARS 流行的中心。那这个城市它采取广泛的方式来控制疾病传播，最终一共有25000人被隔离耶。好，那么课文最后写到，有些人质疑隔离的有效性，那么有些人则是担心它会对经济造成损害。不管怎么样，生命还是比其他事物来重要。好，那么隔离可以防止疾病扩散，挽救生命，这是毋庸置疑的。这个段落有3个重点，我们进入文法时间。好，来看第一个重点是 in total， 表示合计、总计。像我们可以说 ，The singer has released 30 albums in total。那位歌手他总共出过30张专辑。再看第二个重点是 end up， 它是表达以什么样的状况来结束，落得怎么样的下场。好，那 end up 后面可以接现在分词、过去分词、形容词或者是介系词片语。举例来说 ，They ended up having instant noodles for dinner。结果他们最后是吃泡面当晚餐。好，再看第3个重点是 while 当连接词，在这边表示而、然而，是用来说明对比或是相反的情况。这时候它跟 whereas 的意思很相近。例如 ，While Brian likes to travel with his friends, his brother prefers to travel alone. Brian 喜欢跟朋友一起旅行，而他哥哥喜欢独自旅行，这样呈现一个对比状况哦。好，那么以上是今天的讲解，同学别走开，马上回来哦。
Throughout history, quarantine has been reintroduced again and again to prevent the spread of diseases. In 1793, the U.S. city of Philadelphia tried to put the brakes on yellow fever by quarantining sailors outside the city. Perhaps the most famous quarantine case involved an Irish-born cook. In the early 20th century, Mary Mallon carried a type of bacteria that caused typhoid fever. Though Mallon never got sick from the disease herself, officials traced dozens of cases of typhoid fever back to her. They placed her in quarantine and made her promise never to cook for others again. But Typhoid Mary broke her promise and was forced into quarantine again, this time for the rest of her life. In 2003, Toronto, Canada became the center of the SARS epidemic. The city took widespread measures to control the spread of the disease. In total, 25,000 people ended up in quarantine. Some have questioned the effectiveness of quarantine, while others fear its damage to the economy. Still, as history has shown, quarantine saves lives and remains important for disease prevention.
The Truku people of Hualien are famous for their hunting skills. Their most important tool is the bow and arrow. It is even used for fishing. Truku bows are made of hard wood. The arrows are made of light bamboo. When shooting an arrow, be sure to stand tall, with your feet parallel to the target. Hold the arrow in the middle of the bow with only 2 fingers. Aim the arrow by closing one eye and quickly release the arrow from your fingers. Although the Truku people don't use the bow and arrow as a means of survival anymore, the skill is still a very important part of this community.
See you next time!